Now, one of the things I've noticed, and this has been very, very cool, and I've really tested this in hundreds of venues, is I usually sometime in my lectures, talk about the relationship, the necessity of finding meaning as the antithesis of suffering, let's say, because the quest for meaning becomes most compelling when you're simultaneously suffering or someone you love is suffering. That's when the arrow finds its mark, let's say. And I walk people through a thought exercise, I suppose, is, well, what do you have when you're suffering that's going to sustain you? And you might say, well, you have the work that you're still capable of doing and the fruits of your labor that might offer you some security. You have whatever creative enterprises you might be able to engage in that still contain the shadow of meaning, at least. Then you have your intimate relationship and the person who might be caring for you while you're in dreadful condition, and you have your family and your friends. And that's really what you have. And then on the abstract end, maybe you have beauty and truth and justice and, the noble ideals. But then you might ask yourself, well, how do you have the armament of work and creative endeavor and friends and family? And the answer to that is that's in precise proportion to the amount of responsibility you've taken for developing those relationships and those abilities.
That's right.
And so there's a clear pathway between the voluntary adoption of responsibility and the meaning that will sustain you through suffering. And that's a much better enticement to participation for young people than a kind of finger-wagging top-down morality, which is you must behave this way, or you're no good. And even though, as I said, there's some truth in that, it's not an invitational vision. So I had lots of clients and students who would come to me who were in search of a meaningful pathway forward, who said, well, I don't know what to do. And I would say, well, what do you want for your life? And they said, well, I really don't know. And so then I learned two things about that. The first is, don't do nothing. That's a big mistake, because all you do is get older and weaker and you withdraw more. And so even if you don't know what to do, pursuing nothing is a very bad idea. You have no hope then, because hope comes from pursuit, and you're anxious because you need to specify a path. So you have no hope and you're anxious if you do nothing. So nothing is not the answer. That means nihilism is not the answer. And I don't think that's shocking to people, but it's worth laying it out conceptually.
Seems uncontroversial to me, Jordan.
Yeah. Well, you're not a nihilist, or possessed by that, except probably sporadically. So then the next proposition was something like this. Well, look, you don't know what to do. So why don't we just look and see what other people do that seems to work? And maybe you don't have to do any of these things or all of these things, but if you don't know where to start, here's a good place to start. And this is also something conservatives can offer. It's like, well, here's the basic template for a reasonably tolerable life. We'll begin with that low bar. So there's 7 or 8 major domains. So you don't know what to do with your life. Well, let's break your life down. Probably you want an intimate partner. Most people do. Now, you might not, but probably you do, even if you think you don't. And so you might be one of those exceptions, but don't assume that to begin with, because that's an uncomfortable place to be if it's true. Now, maybe you're a radically creative genius like Leonardo da Vinci or Picasso, and you're so idiosyncratic that you can't bind yourself to any one person. But they were 1 in a billion, and probably you're not. Now, maybe you are, but that's a whole different kettle of fish. Probably you want a family of some sort, parents, you want to have a relationship with them, siblings, children. Most people have children. That's the best relationship you're ever going to have if you're fortunate enough to engage in it. And so you probably need a vision for that of some sort. Friends, helpful to have some friends. You could develop a vision for that. You need a job or a career, because otherwise you die, and people think you're useless. They shun you, and then you die. That's a bad outcome, unless that's what you're after. You should regulate your behavior in relationship to temptations like drug and alcohol abuse and sex, because short-term impulsive hedonic gratification doesn't play out well across time, and it tends to make you unpopular. So that's not a good recipe for long-term progress into the future. You should think hard about doing something on the civic front. You should take care of yourself mentally and physically. You should have a plan for that. You need an educational plan because there's probably something you could learn and get better at, and that doesn't have to be academic. It could be extremely practical or creative. And you should figure out how to make productive, generous use of the time you have when you're not working. And so that's like a conservative vision, right? Because it fleshes out the generic landscape of human striving. And it's a good place to start if you don't know where to start. You could start with one of those things and move towards it, or two or four, and maybe you don't have to do all of them. But my experience as a clinician has been that if you are failing on all 8 of those fronts, you're not depressed, you just have a terrible life, right? So conservatives can say, traditionalists can say, here's the basic template, here's the responsibility you can find in meaning. Well, now you got to cobble together something idiosyncratic and unique to yourself. That's the making the archetype manifest in the confines of your own life. But that's the basic way forward. And you know, we've found if students do an exercise like that, a writing exercise, and answer all 8 of those questions, the probability that they'll drop out of university in the first year, about 40% of kids do, roughly speaking, in the first year or two. The probability that they'll drop out is decreased 50%. So just thinking through, just developing a vision on those fronts is highly motivating, and it keeps anxiety at bay, and it unites people psychologically, and it helps them identify with the pathway forward. It's not optional.